Welcome to the fall 2025 Science and Society series. This is our, I think we said, sixth year of Science and Society, making sense of the world around us. This lecture series is co-organized and moderated by Fred Dilla, Executive Director Emeritus of the American Institute of Physics and author of Scientific Journeys, as well as Linda Dilla, former Public Information Officer at the Jefferson Laboratory in the U.S. Department of Energy, and Colin Norman, the former news editor at Science. So with that, I would like to turn this over to Linda. So Linda, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. The first thing you'll notice is that there are only two of the three of us here. Colin Norman couldn't join us because he's in the middle of a Viking cruise. And next month we'll trade places and you'll get him and not us because that's our time to go on a Viking cruise. But he wishes this talk well and is interested in seeing the video, as we all are. I'm going to make this very brief because this is such an interesting topic. Who knew? Of course we should have known, but we didn't. I didn't. And reading the book really did help me understand more about the world around us. Yet again, Jaap de Roode is the Samuel Candler Dobbs Professor of Biology at Emory University, which is in Atlanta. His research includes pioneering studies on self-medication by monarch butterflies, and then he extended it out to the rest of the non-human world. We call those. He also has a real interesting job as the director of Infectious Diseases Across Scales training program, which helps students learn to not stovepipe themselves, but instead to talk across disciplines, which opens up a lot of minds when they do that. So I'd like to invite Jaap to start, and you have to unmute yourself first, Jaap. He's still muted.
All right. No, I know I was muted, but here I am. Just getting my screen shared. Thank you so much for having me tonight. It's really wonderful to be here. Wonderful to see so many people turn up on their Tuesday night to hear about science and how animals use medication. And maybe before I get into it, I'll just introduce two little helpers here. So this is my dog Tucky, who is actually in the book. And then since writing the book, we've got another little dog. His name is Cooper. And so they're both joining me here. They have joined me on many of these talks. They can probably give the talk. If they could talk, they could do the presentation for you tonight. So let me start by telling you how I got into this whole research in the first place. And this really is based on monarch butterflies. As you just mentioned, I started thinking about learning about animals using medication using monarch butterflies. And monarchs are very famous for their migration that they undertake every year from Canada and the United States down to Mexico, where they come together in the millions and millions. And you probably have them flying through Delaware right now, because this is really starting to be the season again when they're flying through on their way to Mexico. And I've had the fortune to go to Mexico several times to really see the butterflies there in their overwintering sites. And it's really amazing because you look at those trees and you really can't see the trees for the butterflies. You look up close, you can see it's layers upon layers of butterflies. It's really, really fascinating. And this is why monarchs are popular. And people love the monarchs and their migration. And therefore, a lot of people are really excited about them, organize festivals. So the photo here is of a festival in St. Mark's, Florida, where the monarchs fly through every year. And the people there organize this festival to celebrate this migration every year. So they're very, very popular. Now, it's not the reason why I started studying monarch butterflies. I started studying them back in 2005, and I came to the United States for the first time. I studied them because they become sick. And so we are very aware that humans get sick and our pets get sick. We take them to the vet. But some people don't realize that wild animals get sick as well, and that includes monarch butterflies. And I had my training as part of my PhD really about understanding parasites and studying their evolution and their ecology. And so finding out that monarch butterflies have a parasite was really attractive for me to try to understand this relationship between this beautiful insect and this parasite, and how do they deal with each other. Now, the parasite in monarch butterflies is known as Ophiocystis electroscura. It's a protozoan parasite, actually quite related to the parasites that cause malaria in humans. It's a really difficult name, so most people call it OE, but it's quite a well-known parasite in the communities that deal with monarch butterflies, because they can really be bad for the monarch butterflies. And what they basically do is they form all these tiny little spores that look like those deflated footballs that I showed you. And when they get so many on their abdomens, these parasites essentially poke little holes in the skin of the butterfly, and then the butterfly will start oozing liquids and basically die of dehydration. And in extreme cases, you'll see a butterfly getting stuck to the chrysalis. It will never be able to fly and will never be able to live. And so this is really kind of, the biggest symptom, the most serious symptom of this disease. This is not the kind of picture you see, right, when you look at National Geographic or you look at an advertising campaign of monarch butterflies. This is really a very, very sick butterfly, and it's caused by this parasite. So what is really nice from a scientific point of view of studying this parasite is that it's really easy to determine if a butterfly is infected, because all we have to do is put a sticker on the abdomen and pull it off, and it will pull off some of the scales. So the big blobs here are the scales of the butterfly, but all those little dots there, all of them, those are the parasites. So we can test whether a monarch is infected without harming it. And it's even less intrusive than those swabs that we stick up our nose when we try to see if we have COVID. And so that makes it a very good system where we can see if butterflies are infected in the wild without harming them. And the way it works is that when these parasites, they form these spores, these little footballs on the abdomen of the butterfly, and then females that are infected, when they lay their eggs on milkweed, because that's the species that monarchs use as caterpillars, they transmit some of those parasite spores to the eggs and to the milkweeds. And when the caterpillars come out, they start eating up the egg and the milkweed, and they start eating up the parasite spores. And that is how they become infected. And then the parasites start growing during the larval stage and during the pupal stage. And then when the butterfly comes out, it's covered again in millions of these tiny little footballs. Now, monarch butterflies are specialized feeders as caterpillars. They can only eat milkweed. And what that means is that if a monarch butterfly were to lay an egg on an oak tree or on a piece of lettuce or what have you, the caterpillars will not be able to survive. So it has to be milkweed. But there are multiple species of milkweed, and some of those milkweeds are very poisonous, very toxic, and others are not. And when I started studying monarch butterflies, the talk about these toxins, these poisons, was that monarchs use them to protect themselves against predators. So when the caterpillars eat these milkweed, they take the toxins, put it in their own tissues, and that is bad for predators. But for me, coming from the parasite field, I was really interested in understanding if these toxins also can work as a medicine. And that is the research I started doing. And in doing that, what I did is I had the caterpillars reared on this non-toxic milkweed, the toxic milkweed, and found that the monarchs do way better when they're infected, when they're reared on this toxic milkweed, because it really reduces their probability of infection. It also reduces the growth of the parasites, and thereby it really alleviates the disease symptoms of the monarch butterfly. So finding that some milkweeds are medicinal and others are not, my thought at the time was, what if monarchs could use this and actually actively use these medicinal milkweeds when they are sick? Can they medicate themselves by specifically using those medicinal plants to fight this parasite that they get? And we did multiple experiments. In the first set of experiments, we had caterpillars that were either sick or they were not, and we gave them choices between these different species of milkweed. And we found absolutely nothing interesting, which is pretty common in science. You do experiments, it doesn't work, you don't find something. But then we thought that actually makes sense, because it's the caterpillars they don't make the choices in nature, right? It's actually the mothers that determine what the caterpillar is going to eat, because it's the mothers that lay an egg on a particular milkweed. The caterpillar comes out of that egg and it's basically born on its food. That is what it's going to eat. So the second set of experiments was really based on females. And so we had the female butterflies, and they were either infected with the parasite or not. And then we put them in these big flight cages in the greenhouse here at Emory University, and then gave them a medicinal plant and a non-medicinal plant, and simply saw how many eggs do they lay on both of those species. And in doing so, we found that the infected butterflies had a really strong preference for the medicinal milkweed. So when they have this parasite, they really want to lay those eggs on this medicinal milkweed. And what's really interesting about it is that these adult butterflies already have these parasites. They're going to pass it on to their offspring. They cannot really avoid that. But what they can do is when they lay those eggs, they can also give the medicine to the caterpillars at the same time. So that when the caterpillars come out of this egg, they start eating the medicinal milkweed and they have a lesser chance of becoming sick, and they don't become quite as sick. So a wonderful example of mommy knows best, right? So these mothers are really good at doing what is right for their offspring. In this case, finding the right medicine to fight this disease that their caterpillars are going to have. So this was quite controversial. So we published these results in 2010, and a lot of people just didn't want to believe it. And that really comes from this idea that animals are not smart enough to use medicine. I love this quote from William Osler at an address at McGill University in 1894, where he said that the desire to take medicine is one feature which distinguishes man, the animal, from his fellow creatures. And this is a sentiment that was shared by a lot of people, I should say, in the Western world, in Western society, and in Western science. And even as recent as 15 years ago, this was a very common belief that it's only humans that can use medicine. But we see similar things that where we think we are unique and we have things that other animals don't have, whether it's language or empathy or culture or the use of tools. Everything that we define as uniquely human always gets broken down when we study hard enough. We look at nature and we actually find all those examples in other animals as well. And so now we really know that we are not the only species to use medicine, and a lot of animals use medicine as well. And that was really the reason for me to write this book, to put all those stories together and say, you know, what is the evidence and what do we know about this? Now, when we talk about the use of medicine, we're essentially talking about an animal behavior, because we're talking about animals that behave in a different way. They start using medicine when they're sick or to prevent becoming sick in the first place. So they're behaving differently than animals that are not infected or that are not exposed to diseases. And so it's a behavior, but we have to be very careful when we look at animals behaving differently because of parasites, because in many cases, the parasites can actually manipulate the hosts, the animals, in ways that are good for them. And I love this picture because this is a pair of flies that are mating. The one at the bottom is the female. The one at the top is a male. But the catch here is that that female is dead. And that female is dead because she's infected with a fungal pathogen. And when you look along that abdomen, there's a lot of this fuzzy stuff. That's the fungus. And what the fungus does, it kills the fly and it makes the wings stand out in an inviting way for the male, in a courtship display that says, come mate with me. And the fungus also produces pheromones, so chemicals that make her smell really attractive. So this male gets attracted to mate with this female, and instead of getting offspring, what he gets is an infection. So this is in a way that parasites can manipulate their hosts. And this kind of thing happens all around the animal kingdom. There's very many different parasites and pathogens, things that make us sick, that really change our behaviors to help them and not the animal. So we cannot just say the animal behaves differently, they're medicating themselves. There are a lot of examples too of animals that have behaviors that are very likely medication, but we don't quite know for sure yet. One great example is lemurs and capuchins. They often really harass these millipedes. And millipedes, a lot of species produce kind of these very toxic liquids And they do that to protect themselves against predators. But what these lemurs and capuchins do is they start harassing these millipedes, pulling them apart, biting them, and that makes these millipedes really ooze a lot of these liquids. And then they start rubbing it in their own fur and into each other's fur as well. And what that does, it keeps mosquitoes away, it keeps botflies away, so it keeps a lot of bad things away from them as a repellent. Now, we don't know yet if that's really the reason why they do it, or whether it's a nice consequence of them just having fun together because they love rubbing this stuff into each other. And it's like saying, some humans, we like to go, for a coffee or for a beer in the pub. That doesn't mean that we're medicating, we're socializing, right? So this could just be socializing, but the added benefit that it protects against parasites. So we have to be very careful. And so the first really careful studies that really showed us that animals use medicine came from chimpanzees. And so for that story, I want to talk about the researchers that really found this in the first place. And this was a couple of researchers. One of them is called Mike Hoffman. And Mike Hoffman is a primatologist who did all his training in Japan. He grew up in Denver, Colorado, but he moved to Japan to do his training. That's really important. And the reason that's important is that the primatology in Japan was done very differently than the primatology in the United States and Europe. And what you're seeing here is a deer. This is a modern impression. I took this picture in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York a few months ago. And it is one of the messengers of the Shinto gods. So Shintoism is a major religion in Japan. And together with Buddhism, which is also very important in Japan, that religion really said there is no clear difference between animals and humans. We are just as much part of this kingdom of animals as the other species. Whereas in Western science, we have really been influenced by this culture of putting people on a pedestal and making us different and unique and better than other species. And so when you look at the primatology in Japan, they give their primates names because they are not worried about assigning personalities to them. Whereas in the West, we would give them numbers because we don't want to, think that they may have personalities or things that make them more human than we want them to be. And Huffman, he worked together with a traditional healer called Mohammedi, who was also a park ranger in Tanzania National Parks, where they did their research. And so together, they were tracking chimpanzees, and they were trying to figure out what is the role of older chimpanzees in chimpanzee societies. And one day they were tracking a particular chimpanzee called Chausiku. And Chausiku was behaving differently. She was lethargic. She was building a nest in the middle of the day to rest. She had very dark urine. She was defecating on her side, all things that chimpanzees don't normally do. And then what they see is she goes over to her brush, pulls off the branches, and then strips the bark of the branches and starts sucking the inner pith of the plant. And at this point, Mohammedi tells Huffman, he says, this is a plant we call Mjonso, and that translates to bitter leaf. And it's a plant that we use as traditional medicine for all sorts of infections. And that's really the first time that Huffman thought, maybe this chimpanzee is using medicine. And so the next day, they find her again. 24 hours after she ate that plant, she recovers. She's healthy. She starts running around. And that's when Mohammedi says 24 hours is what we experience when we use this as a medicine. Now, that was the first observation, but based on that, Huffman did all sorts of studies. So he found that the plants have poisons in them, toxins that can kill all sorts of parasites, including worms that live in the guts of chimpanzees. He found other chimpanzees that do this and get rid of parasites in doing so. He found that chimpanzees eat this plant a lot more during the wet season when there are a lot of worms around. And together, putting all this evidence together, they found really that chimpanzees use this particular plant as medicine. At the same time, this is also in the 1980s, people were looking at birds. And I will say that, these chimpanzee studies were controversial. And for some people, they still are, but they're a little bit palatable because chimpanzees are very much like humans. They've got big brains. They're related to us. So some people started believing that, okay, animals can do this. At the same time, in the 1980s, a lot of people realize that birds often put very aromatic plants in their nests. So they line their nests with all sorts of very strong smelling green plants. And they couldn't really figure out why they did it. But the leading hypothesis became that they did it to keep all sorts of parasites away from the chicks in the nest. But the real evidence for that came much more recently, based on studies in Mexico City. And on the right, you see a picture here, which you may wonder, what kind of ugly picture is that? And it is an ugly picture. It's a sidewalk in Mexico City at the University UNAM inside the city. And what you see there is a few cigarette butts that are littering that sidewalk. Because what I'll talk about now is a study that was started by Montse Suarez Rodriguez. And she was actually an undergraduate student that joined the university. She wanted to figure out what is the effect of urbanization and pollution on the nest building and the health of the chicks of sparrows and finches. And as she was doing her studies, she was looking at all these nests. And then what she found is a lot of white fluffy material that she's pointing at here. She found a lot of this white fluff in the nest, and she couldn't figure out what it was until it rained, and then she could smell smoke. And that was the moment she realized that this white fluffy material is actually the fibers from the filters of the discarded cigarette butts. So these birds collect them, bring it to the nest, pull them out, and put them around their nest. And what she also found is that when the birds have more of these cigarette butts in their nest, they have fewer parasites, such as ticks and lice and mites that suck the blood of their chicks. That wasn't enough, though, because, again, it could be that they're, collecting cigarette butts because it's fun, and it just happens to work against parasites, too. So then she did a really cool experiment, and she actually spent 2 years figuring out how to manipulate the nests of these birds without the birds saying, hey, I'm out of here. This is not working for me. But when she figured it out, what she could do, she could make these artificial nests and then add live ticks, so the ticks that we get when we go on a hike, the ticks that suck the blood, or she added dead ticks, or she added no ticks. And then what she found is that in the nests with the live ticks, the parent birds started collecting a lot of these cigarette butts. And that reduced a lot of the parasites in those nests. It helped the chicks, they survived better, and they also came out of their nest. They had higher fledgling success. So that was really demonstrating that these birds do this in response to these blood-sucking parasites. I like that story for many reasons, but also one of them is that, as you can imagine, cigarettes aren't healthy, and they're not healthy for the birds either. And that's something that we're really seeing with all these examples of animals using medicine. Like human medicines, these animal medicines have side effects. And so they can help against parasites and pathogens, but they can also do harm. And so in this case, when there were a lot of these cigarette butts, some of these chicks started having some abnormalities in their red blood cells. You see the same with the monarch butterflies. If they eat too much of these toxic plants, if the plants become really toxic, it can actually kill the monarchs. And the same with the chimpanzees. That bitter leaf, if they eat too much of it, it can actually kill them. Right? So that's really something that all these medicines have in common. They have side effects. So chimpanzees and birds are both vertebrates with relatively big brains. They can learn, and people think of them as pretty smart in general. But now we know that a lot of animals that are not like that can also use medicine. David Attenborough is one of my heroes when it comes to nature, with always beautiful nature documentaries. He has done so much for this world to really understand nature. And here he is by a nest of ants in the Jura Mountains in Switzerland. And the reason he was there for one of the episodes for Life in the Undergrowth was to talk about what these ants do and what they collect. And what these ants do is they collect this resin, which is the sticky stuff that trees and other plants produce, and they produce it really as kind of a wound repair. So when a tree gets damaged, it will produce this resin to fill up that wound. Now these ants collect it, and they collect a lot of it, and then they put it in their nests, and they put it mostly around where the baby ants are. And what researchers have shown is that by doing that, they really get rid of a lot of fungal pathogens and viruses and bacteria. And in that way, they really keep those ant babies safe and healthy. And so this is more like a prophylaxis where they go out and collect all this stuff to prevent all these infections from coming in the first place. And honeybees do the same. I love this story because there are so many funny things to it, including the fact that it was right in our eyes, in front of our eyes, that honeybees were doing this as medicine for thousands of years. So what honeybees do, like the ants, they collect sticky resin. And this stuff is so sticky that when this worker comes back to the nest, she needs other workers to help her remove the stuff from her legs. And then what the bees do is they mix it with the wax that they make themselves, and they turn it into a substance called propolis. Now, propolis is a medicinal substance that people have used for thousands of years. If you go to South America, there are some places where on every corner of every street you can buy propolis as a, basically an all-round medicine to cure all sorts of things. But people didn't think that bees use it for the same reason. So when we look at wild bees, they live in these hollow trees, and inside hollow trees, you've got really rough surfaces, a lot of crevices. And what these bees do, they fill it up with this propolis, they make it all beautiful and smooth, and people say, oh, that's just some kind of cement. But as it turns out, it's medicine, and the bees use it, and it reduces all sorts of infections, viruses, but also varroa mites, which are really destructive to honeybees. Now, honeybees are very important. They're also undergoing some crises. So when you follow the news, you may hear every now and then that the honeybees aren't doing well and there's massive die-offs. But honeybees are really important for our food. So this is a media campaign that Whole Foods did quite a few years ago, just to illustrate what would we lose if we didn't have honeybees. And this is the produce section. You can see that a lot of the things that we like to eat disappeared. And we estimate that about 1 in 3 bites that we eat as humans are based on pollination by honeybees. But as I said, honeybees are in trouble, and there's a lot of reasons for that. But one of the reasons is that our honeybees are suffering from a lot of parasites and a lot of infectious diseases. If you look carefully, you see this mite sitting here on the honeybee, and that mite is called Varroa destructor. And that really, the name says it all. It's a very destructive mite. So think of this as if we had a tick that was the size of a good-sized donut sitting on our stomach and eating out our liver, because that's what these mites essentially do. But on top of that, they also transmit all sorts of viruses that are really bad for these bees. And so what we have done as humans, when we started really cultivating these bees and keeping them in these hives and these massive beekeeping practices and apiaries, we put these bees in these boxes that have very smooth planks. The bees have nowhere to put this propolis except in the corners where the lid meets the walls. And the honeybee, the beekeepers don't like it because it makes the lid stuck. They remove it. They select for bees that no longer use this medicine. And so we basically have gotten rid of a lot of that natural medicine. On the positive side, you can bring it back really easily too. And so research has shown that when you replace these very smooth planks in these bee boxes with very rough planks with grooves, the bees will fill it up with this propolis and they start medicating themselves. And you can really help these bees. And so this is something that is going on right now. Now, like honeybees, when we look at the livestock industry, it's a similar story. We don't let these animals that we keep use their own medicine. And research at Utah State University, so this is by Juan Leon, pictured here, and a lot of his colleagues, they've shown over many decades that sheep and goats, cattle are really good at medicating themselves. And they're really good at learning medication. So experiments show that when these animals are sick, say they're infected with worms, and you give them particular food that cures them, they make that association. And the next time they are sick, they specifically go for that particular food. But in the livestock industry, we don't let the animals do that. We give them this fixed ration of food where we think it has everything that the animals need. But what it doesn't include is all these natural medicines. So what these researchers are saying, similar to the bees, let's bring back this medicine. And the best way to do that is to have our livestock in paddocks where you grow multiple species, not just grass, but a lot of different species, so they can really assemble their own diet and they can find the medicine that they need. And they also said that even in very industrialized livestock industry, you can give the animals the different ingredients that we would normally put in this mixed ration, and the animals will assemble their own diet and find the medicines that they need. So they're very much pushing for that idea. Let's bring this back and let these animals do the work of keeping themselves healthy. How do animals do all of this? How do they know what to do? Are they smart enough? Those are really big questions. And also the questions that led to a lot of skepticism early on when people started talking about animals using medicine. And what we know now is that there is multiple ways in which animals can develop this medicine. And the simplest way is that it's basically just in their genes. It's like an instinct, like an innate behavior. And the best example for that comes from these woolly bear caterpillars. And woolly bear caterpillars are known also as fuzzy wuzzies. And these often get attacked by really gruesome parasites called parasitoid flies. Here's parasitoid fly maggots in a monarch caterpillar, not a woolly bear. But what these parasites do, so these flies lay eggs on the caterpillars, the maggots come out, they eat their way into the insides of the caterpillar, and then when they are ready to pupate and turn into an adult fly, they eat their way out of the caterpillar and kill the caterpillar in its wake. So these are very, very detrimental, very destructive parasites. Now in these woolly bear caterpillars, the little circle, there's a little egg. So this caterpillar has been attacked, and that egg is going to hatch, and that maggot is going to go inside that caterpillar. But these caterpillars can actually eat a lot of different plants. And research has shown that when they eat plants with high levels of chemicals called alkaloids, that can kill the flies. And what is really amazing is that these caterpillars can eat more alkaloids when they are infected with these flies, and it helps them get rid of those flies. And how they do that, researchers have found out that these caterpillars have 4 different taste receptors, and one of them specifically tastes these alkaloids. And then using tiny little electrodes and very steady hands, they were able to put electrodes in individual taste buds of these caterpillars, and then they fed them alkaloids. And what they found is when the caterpillars were infected, those alkaloids elicited a really strong response. And what that means is that these caterpillars essentially, the alkaloids tasted better to them when they were infected. And what that means is that these caterpillars don't need to know they're infected. They don't need to know what alkaloids are. They don't need to know that alkaloids will help them. All they know is that, wow, these alkaloids suddenly taste really good, so I'm going to eat more of them, and that then gets rid of these parasites. So innate behaviors are important, and I think that plays a role in a lot of different systems. But we also have individual learning that I mentioned with the sheep and the goats that can learn through association. And then there is social learning as well. I mentioned one example of the chimpanzees and how they can suck that bitter pith from bitter leaf to kill worms, but they have another way of medicating themselves, and that is to swallow whole leaves. This is known since the 1960s, because Jane Goodall, when she was first studying chimpanzees, she already found that sometimes you look at the feces of these chimpanzees, there's these whole leaves that are not digested, they're still completely intact. So somehow these chimpanzees swallowed them. Well, research has shown, and a lot of this led again by Mike Huffman, that the chimpanzees, by doing that, they swallow these leaves, and it's always leaves that are really rough, have a lot of sharp hairs on them. And when those leaves go through the gut, they work like sandpaper or like Velcro, and they pick out parasites out of that gut, and then the chimpanzees poop them out. And these hairs also irritate the gut so that stool goes through way more quickly. But as you can imagine, swallowing a whole leaf is not fun. And so what the chimpanzees do, they actually fold them up into a small piece and then swallow it. And as you can also imagine, to fold a leaf, there's many different ways to do that. And different groups of chimpanzees use different folding mechanisms. And when you look at even chimps in captivity, when you give them some of those leaves, what happens is that one individual will come up with a method, and the other individuals in that group will copy that behavior. So now you get cultural differences in how to use this medicine. So that is social learning there as well. All right, so my dogs are still here, sleeping on the table in my lap in front of me. And I'm sure a lot of you have dogs as well. And if you have a dog, you may know that your dog sometimes eats grass. And the question is, why are they doing that? Is that medicine? And it turns out it probably is. But what's really interesting too is that there are very few studies that have been done on domestic dogs and finding out what they eat as grass, why they eat the grass. But what we do know from a lot of carnivores in the wild, and of course our domestic dogs and also our domestic cats, are domesticated from these wild carnivores. And so people have looked at these carnivores for decades now, and they often find whether it's lions or whether it's jaguars or mountain lions or wolves, that oftentimes these animals eat grass. And what you'll find is that when you find that grass in either their stool or in the throw up, that there are parasites there too. And this is a recent study of jaguars where researchers saw this jaguar eat this really rough grass and then threw up and find those parasites. So what that means is that when we look at our domestic animals, they still have this behavior, not necessarily because they have parasites in their stomachs, but they may have an upset stomach for different reasons. For example, when they eat a piece of Lego or a Barbie head doll, like little things that kids leave around your house, and they eat it and they don't feel good. So they don't need to know what makes them feel sick, but what they still do instinctively is eat the grass. And then oftentimes you see your dogs or your cats throw up or poop, and that grass comes out, and that little bit comes out with it as well. So that's where that comes from. Now, another example for the cat lovers among us is that cats really love catnip. And so if you have a cat, maybe you have catnip, or you have toys that are impregnated with catnip. And there's another plant that elicits similar responses where the cats really go crazy over this stuff. And that plant is called silvervine, which occurs more in Asia. And people have known about the catnip response and how much cats love all these plants for a long time. And in Japan, there are folk stories about the battle between cats and mice, where the mice know you can intoxicate cats with the silvervine and thereby win the battle. So people have known this. But it's very fitting that Japanese researchers have only finally realized why cats are doing this. So for this, again, and I find this exciting, is that an undergraduate student that joined Iwate University because she loved cats. She was really interested in their behaviors. And so she worked with her professor to really figure out what is the chemical. That was one of the questions they asked. So when we look at this silvervine, what is actually the chemical that make these cats go crazy? So they extracted chemicals from the plants, put them in different fractions, and put those fractions on different filter papers in these cages, and then let the cats go in there. And as you can guess, number 3, that's the chemical that really, elicits this response. This cat is rolling around and having a good time. And so there's one particular chemical in this plant that makes this cat very exciting. So then they did another really exciting experiment because they were trying to understand, what is it that makes it so? What does this chemical actually do to this cat? And what they found is that this chemical really sets in motion the whole pleasure hormone system. So if there are any long distance runners in this group, you have heard of endorphins, the runner's high, right? So our bodies make these pleasure hormones ourselves. They're basically human-made opioids, and cats have that too. And so this chemical really elicits that pleasure hormone so that cats feel really happy. And so this particular cat, the researchers on day 1 treated the cat just with a salt solution. So on that day, it can feel that pleasure. But on day 2, they gave it a chemical that blocks that whole response. So on day 2, the cat can no longer feel that pleasure when it smells this chemical. And you can see on day 2, the cat is bored. It wants to get out of the cage. On day 1, when it could feel the pleasure, is rolling around in a perfect catnip response, right? So what that means is that this chemical that the plants get from this, that the cats get from this plant, really makes them happy. Okay, but is there another reason, that they use this chemical, and why are they rolling around? So when the researchers went to an international conference, they actually gave their talk. And there was a parasitologist who studied mosquitoes in the room. And she said, when I look at those cats, it really seems to me like they're trying to coat their fur with those chemicals from these plants. And if that's the case, then all that rolling around they do to get that chemical onto their hairs. And if that's the case, that if you put the chemicals at the top of a cage, they're no longer going to roll around at the bottom. They're going to try to roll around at the top. And that's exactly what the researchers found when they did these experiments. You see this cat really trying to get that chemical, but at the bottom it's not rolling. So by doing that, catnip response is really trying to get those chemicals on its fur. And why is it doing that? It helps them against mosquitoes. So they coat themselves in this mosquito repellent. And that is important for cats because mosquitoes can be very dangerous to cats. They transmit things such as heartworm, so really, really bad for cats. And so the researchers found this by having their cats with and without the chemicals, putting them in a cage, releasing mosquitoes, and then finding that the cats with the chemical were really well protected. Now, if you think that's sad, I agree. The researchers agreed too. So then they did the experiments with themselves. So they smeared the chemicals on their own arm, stuck their arms in a cage, and found the chemical protects humans as well. And now they have patented that chemical to develop it into a repellent that we as humans can use to protect against mosquitoes and all the diseases that they give us. So it's a really wonderful example that we can learn from animals to discover things that we wouldn't have discovered on our own. And that brings me to the most surprising discovery for me in writing this book. And that was that we have actually known about this forever. It's only Western scientists that since the 1980s have believed we have discovered new things. If you look at traditional healers and you look at shamans all around the world, they have looked at animals for thousands of years because they know that animals use medicine. And by looking at animals, we can discover medicine ourselves. In North America, a lot of Native American tribes, actually all of them, there are bear shamans that really try to turn into bears and gain the knowledge from bears. And so every Native American tribe here has at least one medicine that is named after bears. And a lot of us have used one of those medicines too. So we think about aspirin, which is like this, small little white pill made by the pharmaceutical industry. It turns out bears discovered that for us in the first place. And when bears come out of their hibernation, they're really inflamed, they're really sore, they're really stiff. One of the first things they do is eat the willow tree bark, and they eat a lot of that. And that bark has a lot of salicylic acid, which is really the chemical that we made into aspirin. So people witnessed this, copied that, and eventually made it into this pharmaceutical drug. It's not just bears. Elephants have taught humans a lot about medicine, both in Asia and in Africa. I have mentioned Mohammedi, who was the traditional healer. His grandfather was a traditional healer too. And he was witnessing an elephant with stomach upset use a particular plant and essentially making a tea out of it in its own throat. And now, even today, people in Tanzania use this particular plant to treat stomach upset. Goats have discovered really interesting things to us too. On my university campus, we have a coffee shop called Dancing Goats. There are a lot of coffee shops around the world called Kaldi. And the legend is that Kaldi was a goat herder in what is now Ethiopia. And when he saw his goats eat the berries of a coffee bush, he saw them become alert and very active. And he related that to a monk from a nearby monastery, who then got those berries and he brewed a drink out of it that we now call coffee. And so this is a drug that a lot of us use to stay alert, maybe to stay away during this talk tonight, right? It's what we do. And it was discovered by goats. A similar story, there is a wheat called horny goat wheat. You can order this at Amazon. As you can imagine what the herder witnessed when his goats were eating this particular wheat. So animals have a lot to teach us. And there is still so much knowledge out there that we are not aware of. And by giving animals credit and accepting that they're really smart in their own ways and have all this knowledge, we can actually learn a lot about our own health and discover new drugs and medicines for us. But the problem is right now we're going through this massive extinction of a lot of species. So as scientists, we think that we're now in the 6th mass extinction. The 5th one wiped out most of the dinosaurs. And now we're losing a lot of species all over again. And it's not just the plants and the fungi and the other things that provide the medicine, but it's also the animals that have the medicinal knowledge, whether they are pharmacists or doctors, but they know where to go for their medicine. And so don't just lose the medicine, we also lose the animals that have the knowledge of where to go. Now, there's a lot of ways that we can try to help with this. I myself am involved with the Rosalind Carter Butterfly Trail, which was started by Miss Rosalind Carter, the former First Lady, and really with the idea of recreating native habitats all around the country and around the world. And because what we're seeing is there's so much nature that has gone, and there are some simple ways to recreate nature. When we look at our front lawns, that is actually the biggest crop in the United States, bigger than corn, bigger than soybean. And this takes enormous amounts of water, fertilizer, and pesticides to keep green for no good reason, because nothing likes grass except for humans. And so we are trying to persuade people, even replacing 10% of your lawn with native plants that includes a lot of medicinal plants, you can help a lot of wildlife. And that wildlife includes a lot of different insects that can find the medicine that they need. But it also includes our pets, because our pets are really good at seeking out the medicines they need. So when we recreate more native habitat with this whole diversity of different plants, including medicinal plants, we help our wildlife, we help our pets, and we can really try to help recreate at least a little bit of the nature that we are losing. I like to close by showing just this little cute video of my dogs eating grass. And this was as part of a photo shoot when I had my book published in March. The university newspaper wanted to write a story on it, and we had to do a photo shoot with it. And they said, bring your dogs because it's fun. And as we were setting up the lights by a little river on campus, my dogs were just there eating their grass. And it was so funny because it was almost like they were saying, guys, I don't know what all this fuss is about. None of this is new because we have known for thousands and thousands of years that there is medicine out there, and we'll show you how to use it. Thank you so much.
That was fascinating. Thank you. I'm so glad you talked about the grass as part of the conversation, because that was going to be one of my questions. That's what Dylan did today, was eat grass again. We think we know why in our case, because it's a delicacy apparently, deer poop and rabbit poop. And
oh yeah.
I don't understand that part of dog behavior, but in our case,
and I don't either. And so I will add that not everything our animals do make sense, and
truly
some of it does, other things don't.
Yeah, I can feed him tuna and he'll go right out and do that.
Yeah.
I have a couple of questions from the audience, and then I have a whole bunch myself. One of them, a really good scientist that we like a lot, Giesel, wrote, and to say thank you for your presentation and that you are a great science communicator. And I think that's a compliment from someone in the field, and I'm so glad that she was able to say that as well. Steve wants to know, how do animals, etc., address physical injuries or degeneration, like a broken tail or a foot, some kind of a thorn in a foot?
Yes, great question. So very recently, so since I wrote the book, there have actually been a lot of new fun studies. So I think there needs to be in a few years a follow-up book with all the other medical practices that animals use. So a few examples, we know orangutans, when they have inflamed joints, they like to rub particular leaves that they mix with their saliva on it. And those plants are the same plants that traditional healers in those same areas of the planet use against arthritis and things like that. Recently, studies have shown that chimpanzees do a lot of care for each other. For example, injury based on traps, when they have got the wire stuck around, they really try to remove that, but also treat it with their own saliva, or they mix it with leaves. So there is some of that injury treatment as well. And also recently, in the last year, fascinating studies showing that in some cases, animals even perform surgery. So ants that have legs infected with a fungal pathogen, other ants will actually go in and amputate that leg to stop the spread of those fungi to the rest of the body. Now, when it comes to broken bones, um, we're not aware of any examples yet where they may do something similar, where they put planks around it or destabilize it. And I think, yeah, there is definitely things that humans do that animals may not do. But at the same time, I think the more we look, the more we're going to find that animals have some really ingenious ways of dealing with injuries and other things as well.
There's an observation by one of our viewers named Sheila. Her pet rats are crazy for mint, less so for basil and parsley, and not at all for coriander. That's something you've run across before?
I think, yeah, so not that specific example, but I know all those different, so all those four plants have really good chemicals that against microbes or keeping mosquitoes away. So mint especially is really good for getting rid of mosquitoes. So is basil actually. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, it depends a little bit on the specific chemicals they have, but there's also personalities. And I think that's another thing that we're learning, that not all animals are the same or have the same preferences. And I think that's one of the lessons. Once you start giving animals credit, you also start realizing that they have their own personalities. And I've given talks like this where people say, my cat doesn't like catnip at all, or my dogs don't eat grass. Yeah, there's individual differences too.
Yeah. So this is Catherine from University of Delaware. We spent some time talking to her yesterday, actually. Would you distinguish between a favorable adaptive behavior and a self-medicating behavior? How much of these examples of behavior, if anything, are considered choices by animals?
Yeah, so I definitely think of all of these behaviors as adaptive behaviors, because when you look at these behaviors where animals use these medicines that are costly, right? They have the side effects as well, but it really helps them maintain their health and protect them against parasites. Parasites are really strong selective force in nature that can really be detrimental. And then the choices themselves, I think, are adaptive, right? So because being able, and you see that, for example, with these woolly bear caterpillars, when they don't have these flies, they eat fewer of these alkaloids. These alkaloids are really toxic. So the ability to choose itself, I think, is adaptive because it allows these animals to make the choices, use it when you need it and avoid it when you don't. But that will also depend on how much parasite pressure there is. If there's always parasites, you may just always go for the medicines. But yeah, I view all of this within an evolutionary framework of adaptations.
Okay, now Fred wants to talk.
Now, I just have a comment, Jaap. It's a fantastic talk, but you opened it by expressing the skepticism that scientific community had that animals would have such behavior, that the only difference between us and our brains and our intelligence separates us from the animals. But I think what you proved is that these animals were also scientists. They did experiments. You know, the chimps found the right leaves. The birds found that cigarette butts, a man-made thing, worked. And the bees, all of them tried an experiment, and they probably tried many experiments before they found one that worked. So they were being very good experimental scientists.
Yeah, and I think, you know what, to get at that, I think what we don't know right now is how often animals get it wrong. And the reason for that is because it has been such a controversial topic with a lot of skepticism. We have set the bar really high to demonstrate that an animal is using medicine. So one of the criteria we use is to, we show that it works. But there must be many cases where animals try something and it doesn't work. Either it doesn't help them, it may even kill them. And so it's not until you realize that animals can use medicine that then you take the next step that you're saying, where it's like, well, in a lot of cases, they have to develop it. You have to make mistakes, and sometimes those mistakes could even be fatal. And I think that's where a lot of new research will have to go now that we accept animals use medicine.
So talk about how you got interested in the field of infectious spores, and where did this all come from when you were going through university? It
It,
sounds so specific.
it was very accidental. And it's always, my students always think that I knew exactly what I wanted to become. And they often ask me, how did you know? I say, I still don't know. I kind of just, I think sometimes you have to follow the road wherever it takes you. There's nice turns and you take a turn that you like. And so on my 21st birthday, my professor, my undergraduate professor, and I did basic genetics at the time, nothing with parasites, but he organized a 1 day symposium and he invited a professor from Edinburgh who gave a fascinating talk on malaria parasites and how malaria parasites in the same bloodstream of mice were competing with each other. And that was really the first time I thought, wow, this is so cool because he is applying ecology to parasites. And I hadn't seen that before. At night, there was a dinner at my professor's house. So I got to talk with this new professor who then became my PhD advisor. So it was basically, if I hadn't gone to that symposium, I wouldn't be here tonight. I wouldn't even work on parasites. I would be working on something else, probably something more boring. I don't know. Maybe something more exciting. I don't know. But yeah, that's how it starts. And once I got hooked on parasites, they're just so fascinating. Because, just like free living organisms, they have all these challenges to survive and reproduce, but even more so because everyone wants them dead, right? So they're under attack all the time. So I find them fascinating. That's how I got into them.
To close, I just want you to talk a little bit about your graduate program that you have where you get all of the different disciplines together and what a difference that's making in lots of different fields, not just the parasitic field or whatever.
Yeah, so I think you often can learn a lot from using knowledge from different fields, right? And so even in the book that I wrote, we talk about biology and parasitology, toxicology, but also anthropology and sociology, putting all of that together. And with my training program, I really try to do that in terms of infectious diseases. So we have programs where people learn immunology and others where they learn ecology, others where they learn public health or global health. And putting that all together forces people to make the translation, first of all, to put their research in a language that they're not used to. But it really opens eyes and it helps people to connect those different skills and those different disciplines. And yeah, my students in the program, they've all said it's just so great to really meet people outside their fields. And it really helps. You think about something like COVID-19, that's public health, but it's also ecology. Where do the viruses come from? And what do we do to curb it? And then we need to design vaccines. You cannot solve this as a single problem. It's like you need all these different disciplines. So that's the goal of the program.
Okay, one more, because we still have 1 minute. How do we locate some toxic milkweed so we can offer both kinds in
Oh,
our garden?
yeah. So the most important thing, please, please, please use native milkweed. There is a lot of difference. So even if you in a place like Delaware, where the most common milkweed is common milkweed, the common milkweeds vary themselves. So some individuals are more toxic than others. So I'd say, get natives for your region and the monarchs will do the rest. They can tell which plants are good for them. But don't plant non-native tropical milkweed, which a lot of people do. It's invasive and it's actually not good for monarchs.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. It was,
Turn it over to.
we're going to turn it back over to Rebecca so that she can finish us up. I was fascinated. I hope everybody else was too. We appreciate you joining us for now our 6th year. Our next talk will be on
October 3rd on vaccines.
yeah, So this is by a guy named Jonathan Cohen, who is an AIDS expert and has now made him an expert of everything. So Rebecca, it's now yours.
Thanks.
Yes, thank
Thank
you.
you.
So just a reminder, you can purchase a copy of today's book through Browse About Books. I put that link in the chat and I'm about to send you an email about that, or you can borrow it through the Delaware Library System. There is the link to the lecture, but you're also going to get an email for next month's lecture, and you'll get an email with that same information. But in the meantime, as is our custom, please feel free to unmute yourself and applaud and say thank you. So go ahead and unmute.
Thank you.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Lovely,
Thank you so
beautiful.
much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
It
Thanks.
was wonderful.
Excellent. Thank you.
Take care.
All right. Thank you. Everyone have a good evening. We look forward to seeing you next month. Bye-bye.